oftentimes with this particular crisis, I know people think about the pain at the pump, right? And that type of energy when there's a bit of there's a shock effect going on right now in the energy space, but there's maybe a ripple effect coming from the critical minerals and the mining space in particular. The way I see this particular conflict affecting our industry, mining, is really there's the initial effect of the conflict itself. There's the effect of the sanctions or potential sanctions or other actions that are being taken around the conflict. And then there's also a third order of the effects of the adjustment that the industry and the global economy is making to accommodate those effects, right? So we are a global supply chain. People use metal and minerals for a whole host of things that folks these days aren't always aware of. And the people that need those minerals and metals are going to have to get them somewhere else if they're currently getting them from Russia and Ukraine or Belarus, right? So those buyers, those supply chains are adjusting in real time. And once they start to buy from other sources or invest in other sectors, it's really hard to get them back into the supply chain and the space that they were in before. So that's just one thing that, you know, I'm seeing happen in our industry, is that readjustment and ripple effect. We're also slightly different as an industry from the energy space. Metal mines metal deposits take a lot of money and a lot of time to find. They're kind of harder to find in some ways than energy deposits, and they're more expensive and take a longer time to build before you actually start to get cash flow. So, you know, the average gold mine in an established market used to take on average $50 million of investment to bring into production and 5 to 7 years to build. Right. So when we look at the investments that were being made in Ukraine prior to this conflict, as of early 2021, the Ukrainians were projecting $10 billion of investment to come into 24 major mining projects in the country. Where do all of those investments stand right now? You know, there's a huge impact to that, and it's going to be really hard to reattract capital into Ukraine. And there are similar impacts, of course, with investments that were made in Russia. From a production standpoint, there is an immediate feedback, including in the critical space. 20% of the world's resources of titanium are located in Ukraine. That is incredibly important for our aerospace industry and a lot of our national security industries. Boeing put out a statement as early as January 31st that this was going to have a material effect on their ability to produce airplanes and support their industry. And there's nowhere really outside of Russia and China for the US to go for titanium. Ukraine is also, they have the largest uranium deposit in Europe, which is also, you know, something for folks to be keeping in mind as we increasingly look at nuclear energy. There are a lot of impacts of the Russian supply as well on what we're looking at. And people's willingness or interest to continue buying from Russia. A big impact I think we may want to tease out in the conversation today is, in addition to palladium and coal and platinum, Russia provides 18% of the world's potash. Potash is a mineral that's critical for fertilizer and crop growth around the world, right? Most people don't associate food with mining, but the fertilizers we get from potash deposits really feed the world. And they are also the #1 exporter of nitrogen fertilizer and #2 in phosphorus and potassium fertilizers. And Belarus is also a significant exporter. This becomes really important because if the farmers who are used to getting potash fertilizers from Russian suppliers can't get access to that fertilizer, they then can't feed their crops fertilizer at the right time, right? And that whole supply chain that Bram's going to talk about also becomes really disrupted, as well as the crops that are grown in Ukraine, right, that are also disrupted by the same supply chain effect. There are some critical minerals that folks maybe aren't thinking of as being present in Ukraine that are also really strategic, like lithium. Prior to the conflict, there were 2 lithium deposits that were up for investment on the border in the contested areas. Those tenders were down to an Australian and a Chinese company that were going to be, were at the top of that evaluation list. And of course, there's great concern with how China is positioned in this conflict. who do we think is going to end up with those deposits, depending on the result of this conflict. There's big impact there. And all of that speaks not just to the impact of those specific investments, those specific projects, but companies' willingness and interest to go back into Ukraine. The biggest concern for mining companies when making an investment in emerging or frontier market or post-conflict, of which, as Lauren said, I've worked in many, is not actually physical security. It's the right to continue owning the asset for 10 to 20 years, right? The rule of law is incredibly important when you're making a significant investment in digging stuff up out of the ground that will take you maybe 5 to 7 to 15 years to realize any revenue or profit off of it. You have to know that you'll still own that project and who you're doing business with from a government perspective.